My name is Lynn and I'm studying to become a B.C.B.A. In today's video, we're going to be covering Unit 3 of Measurement and Experimental Design. And Unit 3 is simply titled Discontinuous Measurements and IOA or Inter-Observer Agreements. So in Unit 2, we covered continuous measure. And so for Unit 3, discontinuous measure, which is something that we tend to do quite a bit within the world of ABA, is mainly the whole topic. So discontinuous observation would be that the occurrences of the behavior is planned to be missed. So basically, we know that we're not going to see all instances of behavior, but we're going to see instances of behavior within a given context in a certain amount of time, right? So this method is where the method of which all instances of target behavior are not captured during the observation period, that's what this is essentially. So we're going to have snapshots or samples of the behavior itself. This is a discontinuous measure. Really want to nail that home. This is most appropriate to use when continuous observation is not practical, of which you will find most of the time continuous measurements are not practical. That being said, what type of measurements do we do? What type of things do we do within the world of discontinuous observation or discontinuous measure? Well, we have interval recordings. So for instance, an interval recording is an observation period that's broken down into intervals, also called bins within ABA. This is also known as time sampling. The bins part is apparently a very common term. I've not heard it. I don't use it in my own company, but we do have time sampling pretty frequently within our practice. There are 4 types of time sampling or bins or interval recordings, so to speak, which is partial interval recording, momentary time sample, whole interval recording, and planned activity check, also known as plot check. It's just the first few letters of the first 2 words and then check. So to break these down, partial interval recording is basically if given a sample of time, so let's say a minute, you record if the behavior occurs at any point in time. So for timing for 10 seconds, count 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So because I performed a behavior that I was observing in that time, that section or that bin or that time sample now has a plus in it because it shows or delineates that the behavior that you're observing occurred in that time sample. For whole interval time sampling, the behavior must occur throughout the entire interval. So for 10 seconds, I have to clap for the entire 10 seconds. If I stop ever during that time, it receives a minus in that bin. But if I clap, and which is, clapping would be the observed behavior, then it would receive a plus if I do it for the entire time sample. As you can imagine, time sampling tends to go within anywhere between 5 seconds to 2 minutes, which 2 minutes is actually kind of a bit long, depending on what you're aiming for. You can have a time sample of, say, 5 minutes to 10 minutes to 30 minutes, but going there kind of becomes a bit disingenuous regardless of what you're trying to do. Momentary time sampling is a fixed ratio time where you check at every given point. So if you're doing a momentary time sample of 30 seconds, you are doing whatever you need to, and at the 30-second mark, you look and observe and see if the behavior is occurring. So momentary time sampling generally, like I said, for all these, usually about 30 seconds to a minute is usually how long they measure. Although, according to literature, as low as 10 seconds is probably the best amount of time for a time sample. But momentary time sampling, you're just checking periodically, but it's a consistent periodical time. So that's momentary time sampling. And then plot check or planned activity check is when you are observing a group of people, so at least more than 2 or 3 people, then you are doing a momentary time sample, but at the designated time, instead of checking whether or not the behavior is occurring, you count how many people are participating within that behavior. So momentary time sampling and planned activity check are pretty much one and the same. It's just how many subjects are you measuring? How many subjects are you observing, so to speak? So Partial interval recording is easier to record than rate or frequency recording. So like event recording, so to speak. Sometimes, because event recording, you have to record the entire time. Event recording is pretty much, there is no time limit. You are just recording every single possible event. But that means you have to be completely vigilant during that entire time period of, say, 2 hours or whatnot, because you are recording specifically every event that it's occurring. It sounds very logistically smart, right, to just record every instance of behavior, but if the behavior is too frequent, or if the behavior is more of a duration that you're trying to record, sometimes it's just not practical to do, especially if it's in a classroom setting and you guys are moving classrooms a lot, or you just simply can't sit and stare. If you have like more than one child that you're observing or more than one subject, then partial interval might be better, depending on, of course, on the behavior and what you're trying to do with the behavior. That being said, all of these interval recordings do have a disadvantage to them, and we will go through them specifically. For partial interval recording, it tends to underestimate the frequency of behavior, because let's say, for instance, that 10 seconds that I'm seeing if a kid claps or not, they could clap the entire 10 seconds, but I only put a check mark to say, yes, this behavior occurred. So whether it happened once or it happened 10 times, it's just showing us, yes, it happened during that time. So it underestimates the general frequency and rate, or higher rate of behavior, right? It will underestimate duration, because the nature of it, like the duration's happening, you're not really managing that. You're just, for instance, if I clap for 9 seconds out of the 10, that gets a single check mark. But if I stop clapping for 2 seconds, and then I continuously start clapping again for another 8 seconds, that's just 2 checks, and that doesn't really tell me if that type of data would be the same if, for the 20 seconds that we watched, I clapped once in the first bin and once in the second bin. It would reflect the same within the data. So because of that, it underestimates duration, because it has a harder time tracking duration. Partial interval recording is better for if you're trying to reduce a behavior. Since you are underestimating frequency, it's gonna be better for when you're trying to see, like, okay, like, did this behavior occur at all? Yes. Then let's try to implement an intervention that reduces this. And that being said, whole interval recording are better for behaviors that you're trying to increase. For instance, if you're trying to increase the behavior of a kid sitting and attending to a book for 10 minutes, and you're doing 30-second intervals, well, having them sit and read for the entire time, that's easily observable first. And secondly, anytime they close the book and get up, that's a minus on that bin, right? But if they come back and sit down and they continuously go through and read, you're trying to increase that. That's a plus every time, every 30 seconds that passes that they're sitting and reading. So generally speaking, partial interval recording, for the most part, are applied to behaviors that you want to decrease, and then whole interval behaviors are for behaviors you're trying to increase. That's not a solid rule, of course, but for the most part, because of the nature of the recording, that's generally what happens. Whole interval is easier to record than event recording, of course, again, because the moment the kid, for instance, in that reading instance, the moment the kid stops reading, you've automatically put down a negative on that bin, and you can just do whatever you want for the next 20 seconds or whatever that bin has left in that time. But for that, it does underestimate duration again, and it's, once again, better for tracking behaviors you're trying to increase. For momentary time sampling, you measure only at the end of the interval, so it's the most accurate between partial interval, whole interval, and momentary time sampling, because it doesn't have a bias, because you're checking at specific intervals. So it's not influencing the rate or frequency of behavior. It's just, does this behavior occur within this amount of frequent times that I've been observing? And because of that, play check or planned activity check kind of follows the same rules of, it's fairly unbiased, so to speak, because you are designating a time to check and see who is in that behavior, and it can be used for other behaviors you want to increase or decrease if you're trying to measure that behavior. As far as biases within interval recording, they can be mitigated, very much so, by the length of intervals being recorded. So the longer the interval, the more bias that measure will have, right? Because once again, if you're checking every 5 seconds for if a kid will clap, it's a lot more accurate to overall time than if you're checking for every 2 minutes if a kid is going to clap. Because if a kid claps once in 2 minutes, that entire interval now marks that they behaved or had a response. Versus every 5 or 10 seconds, you can now delineate, okay, there was only one time out of the 10 or 20 or 30 bins, which means that, okay, realistically, they only clapped once, right, during this whole set of session or whatever, versus, oh, this behavior occurred over the full 2 minutes, so we have to reduce it now or whatnot. So just be aware that there are biases within each type of interval recording, although momentary time sampling and play check have less bias to them. A momentary time sampling and play check still miss behaviors. Obviously within their definition, it's you plan to miss every occurrence, but you're trying to take quick snapshots of the behavior to see whether or not it's on the increase or decrease in general. The next section of Unit 2 discusses discrete trial probes, which are basically discrete trials or snapshots of data taken before intervention has been placed. So basically you're probing, you're seeing what the baseline is, you're checking what the skill is or what the behavior is, and you're kind of testing and saying what is to be expected of the baseline. Within discrete trial probes, there is a subdivision called first trial data, which basically means anytime throughout testing or intervention, you will take a probe session, or I'm sorry, a probe trial, so to speak, just to see if the kid is warming up or if they've actually mastered the skill. So sometimes when you are working on a skill, the first trial that you take is just to see kind of if they're paying attention. Like, I do this all the time at work. Sometimes a kid is just warming up. They're just starting to remember, like, oh yeah, I gotta work, or oh, I gotta identify these colors or these letters or these numbers. But they don't quite want to at that moment. You don't fully have their attention. So you will present the first trial and it's kind of a probe. Are they paying attention? Are they actually going to respond? And if they do respond, do they respond correctly? Are they actually mastering this, or are they just kind of warming up? Sometimes this actually happens quite frequently. It happens where you think a kid is not mastering something, but then later on in different contexts, it shows that they've not only mastered it, but they've generalized this skill. And it's like, oh, that's weird. How come they don't do it when I first introduce it to them or when I'm trying to introduce it to them? Well, I mean, they're kind of warming up, so to speak. You don't quite have their attention. They want to have fun first. They're not really looking into anything in particular, right? They're not paying attention to you. The environment is not suited for them just yet. That's where first trial data can come into play. And so you just have to be aware that is sometimes that has an effect on your data. From there, the unit moved on to derivative measures. So a derivative measure is a form of data obtained from a direct measure of behavior. So percent or trials to criterion, which basically trials to criterion basically means what is the criteria for them to actually learn this item. So they will perform this item at an 80% accuracy this many times in a row. So that's trials to criterion. How many times did it take them to practice to get to that point, and what is that point? So once again, percent correct, percent occurrence, the discrete categorization or coding. So coding basically means when you're describing things. So for instance, if you've ever taken data as an R.B.T. and you wrote down PP for partial prompt, or FP for full prompt, or VP for verbal prompt, those are all codes. We've categorized what they are, we know what they are, and that's coded, but we're also taking data. What percentage of this response was reliant on a verbal prompt or a full prompt? So these are derivative measures. They're not specific to the behavior itself, but it is showing you how many times you've actually prompted them, the percentage of occurrences of that, and how many trials it was presented to this kid prompted. So that's a type of derivative measure. The book describes it as classifying responses to discrete categories. So once again, full prompt, verbal prompt, partial prompt, independent. So independent would be a fully correct response because they independently performed this action. It goes back again to permanent product. It kind of refers back to it quite a bit because that, once again, is a form of measure. So while it can fall within continuous measure, you can also use it for discontinuous. It's very much a discontinuous measure for a lot of things. In continuous measure, it would be how many reports did they perform? How many reports did this worker fill out today? So they wrote like the entire performance. You watched them and they filled out like 20 reports or whatever. But realistically, you don't need to watch them the whole time, right? So a discontinuous measure would be, well, I assigned them 20 reports and they performed 20 reports within the day. That's a permanent product because it's a permanent change to the environment that is measurable and it's recognizable. And for discontinuous measure, it is one of the methods of doing so. Permanent product is definitely something you can use. Once again, you have to make sure that these permanent products can be uniquely created by this behavior or performed by this behavior. Otherwise, you will have some issues with it, right? So what if someone else wrote the report, or what if it gets mixed in and you don't delineate who writes what? It's just a report shows up and it has multiple people contributing to it. Well, do you really know then that your worker that you're observing did any work in that, or was it just covered by other people? Just be aware of response products or permanent product in that manner. That being said, measurement tools. One of the biggest things that we always have to be concerned with are not only how we are measuring these things, but how accurate these things are. So for instance, technology. I use an iPad for my work, and I can say, even with today, the system that we regularly take data on, which I'm sure some of you have heard of, we use Central Reach. It was down for emergency maintenance the entire time I was at session today. I literally had to take data on a piece of paper and I had to remember what goals we had, because I even texted my boss and I said, hey, can you send me the paper version of this kid's goals? And she said, no, the entire system is down. I can't even access my caseload right now. Schedulers cannot change your schedule right now. Nothing, no one can do anything. So I was like, okay, so we can either cancel or I can just track what I need to. So that's what I did. That being said, technology, you have to know how to use it. Make sure that your R.B.Ts know how to use it. Taking pencil or paper data, be aware that if you're doing anything like partial interval recording or whole interval recording, that can be really difficult with just pencil and paper. It's a lot easier when you have a computer that does timing for you and either chimes or immediately moves on to the next bin as the time goes on so that you can take the data. So there's pros and cons to having low tech and high tech, right? So just be aware of that. The unit kind of ends off in a funny way where it describes how LeBlanc et al. In 2016, in an article from 2016, created the decision-making model, which helps you determine whether or not you should do partial interval, permanent product, momentary time sampling, play check. It's an entire flow tree of decisions, and it's very important to know. It's very good to know. Does everyone use it? Not necessarily, but it does help you narrow things down because there's no systematic way of determining what to use when you're measuring behaviors. So LeBlanc made one. LeBlanc is also an instructor for FIT, so I have her in one of my classes, but she did write this whole decision-making model, and it is pretty effective. Just be aware that in this class they will reference it and they will tell you, like, keep it handy and keep it by. The last thing that the unit touches base on is inter-observer agreement, and it tells you how to calculate each of them. Now, inter-observer agreement is basically to what efficacy is everyone observing the same thing, right? So if I and two other people are given the task to observe a behavior, will we all have the same count? Will we have the same mean per interval or per event? Or will we have the exact count measured? Will it be the same? Or to what degree will we not agree, right? So inter-observer agreement. For all that it is, inter-observer agreement is good to know, but it's really behind the curtains. So this is something that we write to check our validity. This is something we use to check whether or not there's something called observer drift, where sometimes what the observer measures is no longer congruent with what they're supposed to measure. So you test that, or you push back on that by having inter-observer agreement measure. So you say, like, hey, both you and I are going to measure how many times this kid hits himself. And if there's any incongruentness of that, then we're going to try and make sure that we're getting at least 90% agreement, if not more, right? So in IOA, it is a method to kind of back check that we're measuring the correct things. So it's not to necessarily help what the actual observation of the behavior is, but it is kind of checking, it's a wrench in a machine. It's to make sure that we are smoothly following everything as we need to and as we intended. And so when you have inter-observer agreement measures, you're checking your definition, you're checking your consistency, you're checking time of day, you're checking for confounding variables, really, because what if for one therapist, they have a really low count of the kid screaming, and another therapist, they have a really high count of screaming. Is it because of the time of day the kid is screaming at different times? Is it the people present? Is there a stimulus control issue? Or are they actually counting the wrong things? So it's another litmus test to see whether or not you guys are congruent or not. So that's when you would have both therapists preferably observed in the same session along with yourself, and then you guys cross-check each other. So inter-observer agreements are just cross-checking and getting a high percentage of agreements to that. So that was Unit 3. It's a bit lengthy, and once again, discontinuous measures are kind of the bread and butter for a lot of the things we do within ABA practice. So that's why it was such a lengthy unit based on that, and it has its own unit. So hopefully that video was helpful. If you have any questions, comments, or examples, I always love examples, leave them down below in the comments, and I will see you in the next video.